Hi there. In this, I'm going to be talking about the round three motion from Drexel Pre-WUDC. This is a poem motion. You're given two poems and then asked from the perspective of a Christian struggling with religious disillusionment, which of the two poems you ought to prefer. So this is, of course, an extremely strange and in many ways beautiful motion. It's strange in the sense that it requires you to do literary analysis of looking through two poems and determining their meanings, and then comparing their literary devices, their intended messages, and so on and so forth. But it's also a beautiful debate in the sense that it allows you to make many aesthetics arguments about what is meaningful and valuable in art, and also what you, as the actor in the motion, find comforting or relieving or moving in a moment of emotional turmoil. So the way that I'm going to walk through this debrief is basically to look at each poem individually, talk about with each poem what its meaning is, what each stanza might mean, how you could interpret it, so on and so forth, and then sort of bring the two poems into direct discussion. I won't necessarily outline a specific set of gov arguments and then a specific set of op arguments. They'll be embedded in the discussions of poems. And of course, because this is a creative literary debate, there are very many arguments on very many aspects of these two poems. And so, of course, this is not exhaustive. This is more intended to be inspiration for how you might approach this motion or this type of motion and come up with some ways of approaching this debate from any position on Gov or on Op. So let's dive in. So the first poem that you're given is a poem called The Collar. And you're given roughly 23 lines of poetry divided up into a few stanzas. So I won't read the poem aloud. We'll just kind of go through the poem piece by piece, and we'll periodically reference the glossary. And what I'll try to do is basically approach this from the perspective of, suppose you're looking at this poem in prep and you're trying to get a rough sense for what does this poem mean and how can we make arguments about it. In order to make arguments about the poem, probably the first thing that you need to do is just understand substantively what the poem means. So the best way to do this is just to go sort of piece by piece. Of course, it's a little easier if you've read the poem first. So if you haven't already, presumably you've done the debate. So hopefully you're familiar with the general gist of the poem. But of course, do that prior to thinking about each individual line and what the lines individually mean. So if we dive in and just start thinking, okay, what does the poem mean and what meanings can we draw? So the poem starts with, I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad. And we're then subsequently told that abroad means to go away. So we can sort of immediately know, I'll just add annotations, by the way, in red. We know that abroad means go away. So this roughly means, I struck the board and cried, no more, I will go away. So sort of immediately, if you just think about the words that are being used here, cried and struck, these are both verbs. And if you sort of think about what these words mean or how they're typically used or the kind of the emotions attached to them, you can sort of immediately get a relatively negative sense from the opening line of the poem. If you think about the dialogue that's being said here, the dialogue that we're immediately given is no more, I will go away. So clearly the speaker is fed up and frustrated and clearly is expressing that fairly early in. And sort of words like cried, for example, give a similarly somber tone to the opening of the poem. So we're sort of starting off with someone speaking. We don't know exactly what they're speaking about per se. We can probably infer it's religion because that's what the motion ends up being about. But the poem initially starts off on a general note of frustration or annoyance. The speaker then says, and this is still continuing the speaker's discussion, what shall I ever sigh and pine? And then we're subsequently told down below that ever here means forever. So we'll sort of add the for just here in red just to give you a sense of what this means. And that's important because if you think about what this line means, well, what does it mean to sigh and pine? Well, we're told that pine means to lose vigor and health. So sigh, we can sort of think of as meaning perhaps as crying or sighing in the literal sense of kind of letting out air. And sigh and pine, where if we think of pine here as basically losing health or vigor, we can sort of clearly get this continually negative, nihilistic sense from the speaker. So we're told the speaker says, no more, I will go away, or I want to go away. And then the speaker continues on to say, basically asking a question, shall I forever sigh, like be sad, and pine, lose health? So it seems like the speaker initially is saying something along the lines of, will I always be so sad? Will I always be so devastated? Will I always be in such a difficult position? We're then told next, in the sort of next two lines, that my lines in life are free. Free is the road, loose is the wind, as large as store. Store is defined down below as something in abundance, a large quantity of sorts. And this is interesting because this sort of contrasts with the opening three lines of the poem. So the opening three lines of the poem seem explicitly negative and fairly nihilistic about the future. So the speaker wants to go away. The speaker is sort of concerned about always being in this depressive state. We're then sort of given this contrasting image of what life could be. So my life is free. It's free as the road, loose as the wind. It's large. It's abundant. So if we think of store here basically as meaning abundance, what the speaker sort of seems to be doing here is sort of drawing a contrast of sorts between what the speaker has, which is this life of freedom where they're loose, they're able to do as they please, they have this great abundance around them. Yet at the same time, and I mean that in kind of in a more metaphorical sense, what the speaker seems to be doing here in contrasting between 4 and 5 and 1 through 3 is basically lamenting or kind of being sad about the fact that although they theoretically had so much, or they could have had such great life, they could have had this great joy and meaning that comes from freedom and abundance, they are instead in this state of wanting to go away, to leave this abundance, to leave or to desire this freedom, because they are in this state where they're losing health, they're sighing, and so on and so forth. Then the speaker continues on in the next couple of lines. Have I no harvest but a thorn to let me blood and not restore what I have lost with cordial fruit? A couple of terms are then defined later down below. So here, let sort of means bloodlet, and what it basically means in this context is kind of like letting blood out of the body, kind of like exhausting the body of its blood, as sort of historically a medical technique, but that's not important to the debate. And then we're sort of told that cordial sort of means restorative or healing. So we can sort of think of cordial, maybe we'll use healing here. So if you think about what this means, have I no harvest but a thorn? Well, have I no harvest is kind of clunky, but what it seems to more or less mean, if we kind of think about it, is, and I'll put this in red just for annotation's sake, do I only have, or have I no harvest but a thorn? In other words, is the only thing that I have, that's the way I'll put it, is the only thing that I have, a thorn. And here, harvest, we could sort of interpret harvest here maybe in one of two ways. One way might literally be harvest as in like a farm harvest, when you're harvesting crops and you're taking in what you've gotten from the ground. It might also be a bit more metaphorical about not just literally, oh, I'm a farmer and, my crops haven't been growing very nicely. It might also be more metaphorically about the difficulties that the speaker is experiencing or the inability to extract value from life. So let's think then about what this means either in the agriculture or metaphorical interpretation. Have I no harvest but a thorn to bloodlet me? In other words, to like let blood out. And what this sort of seems to suggest is the speaker is kind of, again, is still in this kind of sad, depressive, lamenting state of thinking, is the only thing that I've harvested, is the only thing that I've reaped, a thorn, something prickly, something sharp, that's basically bleeding me dry. And of course, that's, even if you don't get the exact meaning of the phrase, maybe you're looking at this and you're thinking, this is really tough English. And fair enough, that's actually going to be one of the arguments we talk about later, the difficulty of this poem. But if you just think about even what this sort of seems to mean roughly, if you think about words like thorn and blood, and even let meaning bloodlet, like it's pretty clear just based on the words that are being used that something pretty negative is being discussed. So even if you don't get the exact meaning here, you can still infer the general gist of what the speaker is talking about, which is this generally pessimistic outlook. The speaker continues, and not restore what I have lost with healing fruit. So again, this kind of is an extension of this idea of harvesting a thorn that bleeds you dry. The speaker is harvesting not fruit, which is what you might expect a farmer to harvest, right? Something that heals, something that nourishes. And instead, what the speaker in the poem that is harvesting is something that's actually quite negative. The speaker then continues, sure, there was wine before my sighs did dry it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. Is the year only lost to me? So this seems similarly negative just off the bat if we think about tears, drown, lost, sighs even you might add in, are kind of all of these negative, fairly saddening words. that kind of continue this theme that so far has run from 1 through 12, which basically is a generally problematic view on life. And we can sort of perhaps also loosely imply something about religion, as we'll get to in a moment, especially because we know this poem is, per the info slide, if you sort of think back originally, it's about the narrator's frustration with religion and God. And so we do sort of know that all of this frustration seems to be directed, at least in part, towards religion and towards God. So let's actually parse through what this means. So sure, there was wine, but my sighs did dry it. Now, here, this is a little bit tricky, and honestly, you could probably interpret this in a couple of ways. The way I probably interpret sure there was wine before my sighs did dry it is that the speaker used to have, in this case, you might literally interpret wine as just meaning wine, but wine also you might think of as having kind of biblical references maybe, or kind of having a grander meaning for possessions or earthly collections. But the speaker seems to be saying, sure, there was wine, something the speaker had, wine maybe literally, before my sighs, like, kind of the sadness and difficulties, if you interpret it metaphorically, or literally just the sighs of the speaker, gulping down wine in a moment of hardship did dry it. Here, dry, you can sort of think of as exhausting, depleting the wine, taking it away in the sort of literal sense, right? Like you have wine, it's wet, and then it becomes dry because you've consumed it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. Similar parallel here. So in both 9 in the first half of 10 and the second half of 10 and 11, what we're basically kind of given here is the speaker alluding to past possessions, wine and corn, and then the speaker's sadness drowning those things out. Literally in the case of tears, maybe the corn, maybe this might mean bread, for instance, might be maybe one way to interpret this. Even if it's not bread, it could literally just be food more broadly. And what we sort of get a sense of is the wine has been drunk, the bread has been drowned in tears. And again, the same piece of advice I gave earlier applies here. Even if you're struggling with the specific language, you can sort of get the general gist of what the speaker's saying, right? Drown, tears, all of these are very difficult phrases that suggest the speaker is really not in a great headspace. And so what we can sort of imply from this loosely is the speaker used to have meaningful possessions. They used to have wine, corn, maybe bread. Maybe this is a more biblical allusion to greatness in religion, of having a good relationship with God, but it has been lost. And this sort of connects back to even this original opening 4 or 5 lines, right? Where the speaker kind of alludes to this, this sense of abundance and freedom that has been lost, which is why the speaker now feels like they're always struggling or sighing or crying or losing health or wanting to go away. Is the year only lost to me? Well, this is interesting because, so is the year lost to me? Maybe this is sort of a further extension of the speaker's general attitude of, is all of this for nothing? Have I sort of lost everything, right? If you just think about even just literally how the sentence sounds, is the year lost to me? It sort of makes it seem like the speaker is frustrated with the fact that the meaning in their life seems to have evaporated. And this word only here might be particularly important because what it's sort of suggesting is the speaker feels alone in this, right? In other words, is the speaker isn't just saying, look, I used to have all these great things and now it's gone. The word only sort of implies this is happening just to me. It's just affecting me. There's no one else who's going through this particular hardship. So when we put this together with the sort of previous 3 lines, the speaker is acknowledging what they used to have and what they have since lost, and then alluding to this grave sense of solitude, of being alone in this hardship and in this struggling. So putting all this together, we have a pretty negative picture so far of the speaker's life. And again, we can extrapolate that to a sort of understanding of God or of religion as this sense of loss, this sense of God as being unable or unwilling to provide for the speaker. That's why the speaker's wine and corn have been depleted. We might think of this as sort of being, the speaker feeling like they're bleeding out, that they've lost their fruit, their harvest is but a thorn. All of this suggests a very sour outlook on God, on the nature of God, and the relationship that they happen to have with religion. So let's then talk about the next few. The next few lines, that is. Next up, we have, recover all thy sigh-blown age on double pleasures. Leave thy cold dispute of what is fit and not. Forsake thy cage, thy ropes of sand. Now, this is interesting because it's a shift in tone, right? Like even just look at these words, right? Recover, kind of meaning, to take something back. Double pleasures. It kind of these seem more positive words, kind of intuitively, and a little bit more interestingly, these are all words that are present tense. These are all things about what's happening now. It's kind of commanding the speaker to do something. Recover, leave, forsake. These words, recover, leave, forsake, they're all present tense, right? They're all saying, we should do something now. We should recover, we should leave, we should forsake. And what this sort of suggests is that there's something going on in the poem between lines 12 and 13 where the speaker is basically shifting focus away from sort of this lamenting, sorrowful, sad state of dissatisfaction and frustration with God, perhaps to a different outlook on religion. So let's think about what it means. Recover all thy sigh-blown age. So we're told that sigh-blown age means years of sorrow, and thy means your. So we can sort of think of this as meaning recover all your years of sorrow. Now, what does recover mean here? Well, again, you could interpret it in a couple of ways, but it seems like the most intuitive way is, if you think about like, what does the word recover kind of literally mean? It sort of seems like what we're basically saying here is make up for all of these years of sorrow. Get back for all of these years that you've been sad. Do something to make up for it. And we sort of get that in the next sentence, right? Make up for all your years of sorrow on double pleasures. Double pleasures here, the word double sort of suggests you've had it bad for so long, maybe you can take things back and start living a meaningful life. Okay, so basically what we have in 13 to the first half of 14 is basically a generally positive outlook, more or less, on what the speaker could do in the future. You can reclaim your life. You can live a doubly pleasurable life. How are we going to do it? There's a colon. That kind of seems to be signaling, okay, here's what we're going to do as the speaker to take life back. We're going to leave your, that's what thy means, so we can kind of put that in here, leave your cold dispute of what is fit and not. And fit, we're told, means religiously acceptable. And then we're told that forsake, by the way, means reject or renounce. So let's say reject. Okay, so we're told in order to live this life of double pleasure, you should leave your cold dispute of what is religiously acceptable and not. Okay, so this is pretty explicit. Basically, the speaker is saying, I want to leave these sorrowful years, these years of bloodletting and thorns and no fruit and no corn and no wine, and I want to start living a doubly pleasureful life. How am I going to do it? I'm going to do it by rejecting this dispute, this disagreement I've had over what is religiously acceptable or not. So this seems like a profound statement of rebellion. It's basically saying, in order to live this pleasureful life, I will reject my faith. I will not care anymore about what is religiously acceptable or not. I will simply move on. We're next told that the speaker should forsake, reject your cage. Again, thy here meaning your cage, your ropes of sand. Now, this is very hard to parse through. This might be the hardest part of the poem, arguably. But you can sort of, and part of the reason it's hard is because it is legitimately interpretable in several directions. But I think the most meaningful way to interpret this, forsake your cage, your ropes of sand, is to think about it in context. In 14 and 15, we're talking directly about religion. The speaker is basically telling themselves or is being told, leave your cold disagreement with religion. Leave your frustrations with religion. Reject religion wholesale. And think about what the speaker is then categorizing religion as. Religion is a cage. It's something that traps you. It's a rope of sand. Now, the phrase rope of sand doesn't make sense at first because it doesn't make sense. A rope is something that, you can sort of use productively, right? You can move it around. You can tie things up with a rope. A rope of sand is useless. Like literally visualize it. What happens with sand when you try to pick it up or move it? It just crumbles in your hand. It's useless. So perhaps what this is sort of saying implicitly is if we're thinking about cage and ropes of sands as being connected to what happened in the previous sentence, which is religion, the speaker is sort of portraying religion as this trapping cage of little value. It's a rope of sand. It's something that constrains you, but it's not important. It can be taken away, it can be eliminated, it can be rejected, or in the poem's term, forsaken. So basically, this section here is basically saying, in contrast to 1 through 12, reject religion, move away from these disagreements, get rid of this cage, throw off the rope that is holding you back and constraining your freedom. And that's even a throwback to 4 and 5, where the speaker is directly talking about freedom. Let's then see where the poem goes next. 17. So thou didst wink is defined for us down below. So we're told that it means you closed your eyes. So where there we go. While thou didst blink, that's very annoying, kind of older style English, seems to be while you closed your eyes and would not see. Here that just means would not. So we can sort of interpret this to mean there we go. While you closed your eyes and would not see. Away, take heed, I will abroad. Okay, this is very weird and very weird language. So let's see what we can kind of gloss together here. So we have away, take heed. Take heed means pay attention. So we can sort of put this in here. I will abroad. And we're told earlier what abroad means, right? Which is go away. So that's from up over here in the very first opening stanza. So think about what this means in totality. While you closed your eyes and would not see, away, pay attention, I will go away. What this sort of seems to be saying, perhaps, is it's an extension of this rebellion, right? It's basically saying, while you closed your eyes and would not see, again, this is past tense, right? It's you closed your eyes, you would not see. Now, away, take heed, I will go abroad. So what this sort of seems to be saying, basically, in kind of this discussion that's being had between thy or you, thou, the person that's being addressed here and the speaker, is basically this contrast between when you were religious, you had your eyes closed. You weren't looking at things. You weren't thinking. You were blind, in essence. Now, this is where there's the pivot to I, the speaker now in the present moment. You, being addressed, should take heed. You should pay attention to this because I'm going to go away. I'm going to sort of live this life that's being described here in 13 through 16, right? I'm going to leave these years of sorrow. I'm going to reject the cage, these ropes of sand. And how is the speaker going to do it? They're going to do it by rejecting religion, right? That's what sort of 14 and 15 mean. So in conjunction, 13 through 19 is basically, in essence, in order to get rid of these years of sorrow, these thorns, this bloodletting, I'm going to reject my religion. I'm going to throw off religion. And while I used to be blind, and while I used to not see, now I will, because I will go away from religion, and you should take watch. You should pay attention to this. The last part of the poem is 20 through 23. We're told, but as I raved, we're told means speak with extreme emotion, or spoke with extreme emotion. So we can sort of gloss that here. While I spoke with extreme emotion and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methought, and methought here means I thought. Let's put that in because that'll be important in a second. I thought I heard one calling child, and I replied, my Lord. Now, this is a little bit difficult to parse through. So let's sort of think about what this means. As I spoke with extreme emotion and grew more fierce and wild at every word, well, that sort of seems to be discussing what kind of was just happening earlier, right? Recover, O thy sigh-blown age, on double pleasures, leave thy cold dispute of what is fit and not, forsake thy cage, thy ropes of sand. This is all very, extreme emotional. It's about this fierce, wild desire to get rid of religion. That sort of seems to be what's being said here in 20. And even if you don't connect 20 directly to the previous two stanzas, you can sort of think about it intuitively as, the speaker is, again, speaking in the past tense here, as I raved, as I spoke, and grew more fierce and wild at every word. Then the speaker pivots back to the present. And the speaker says, and this is what the poem says, I thought I heard one calling child, and I replied, my Lord. Now, this is an important phrase because child and my Lord, this seems to be directly religious, right? My Lord is a pretty obviously religious statement, so we can sort of maybe think about this as being something about religion. And child, you might think of as kind of the relationship, perhaps, between the Lord and his subjects. So this final part here basically seems to be saying, as I was having this rebellion, as I was opening my eyes and saying I would go away and pledging to throw off the cage of religion, I thought I heard someone call to me. And they called me child, and I replied, my Lord. Now, this is interesting because this seems to basically suggest that during the rebellion, the speaker heard from God or heard from something that is religious in nature. That's why the speaker thought they heard someone call child. And the speaker replies, my Lord. And that pretty clearly seems to be a reference to the speaker heard God. Now, this is fascinating if you think about in context how this fits in. Because remember, the previous two stanzas were all about rejecting religion, not believing in religion. But this final concluding sort of two parts of two lines here seems to actually suggest that the rebellion is over. I thought I heard one calling child, and I replied, my lord. If you reply, my lord, that is pretty directly a sign of obedience, right? It's a sign of submission. If you say my lord, you don't say my lord to something that you don't believe in or something that you reject. You don't hear a voice calling to you from what is almost certainly God based on the usage of the phrase my lord without it being some sort of religious being. So what we have in this poem basically is between 13 and 19, even 20 and 21, this buildup of revolution, of throwing off religion, for it to all come crashing down at the very end, right? At the very end, we basically get this idea that actually the revolution is over. The belief in God is restored. But it's interesting the way that it's restored because the relationship that's portrayed between God and the narrator here is what? It's one of master and servant, sort of, right? My Lord is what God is described as. The speaker, the person who's talking here, is described as child. It's a very hierarchical relationship. And we'll think about that more in terms of what the poem means about God's nature. Okay. So that's kind of broadly what the poem seems to mean. It starts with this lamenting about how hard life is, about how difficult things are, and how the speaker's life has been ruined. The speaker then has this sort of moment of hope, of rejection of religion, of this desire to throw off religious belief, all for it to end sort of at the end with this statement of submission to the authority of the Lord. Okay, so that's the caller. Let's talk about Vespers. So Vespers, we're told, is a Christian service of evening prayer. Okay, we'll think about the relationship between the poem titles later. So Vespers opens with, even as you appeared to Moses, because I need you, you appear to me, not often, however. Now, immediately, before we even start thinking about the substance of Vespers, it's worth noting that Vespers is a much more readable poem right off the bat, right? Like immediately off the bat, like just compare the opening line of the caller to the opening line of Vespers. The opening line of the caller is, I struck the board and cried no more, I will abroad. And we already need a term glossed like right away. Meanwhile, Vespers opens with basically a sentence. Like if you typed out the sentence, even as you appeared to Moses, because I need you, you appear to me, not often, however. Like, yeah, it's a little clunky and it's a little weird, but it's readable. Like if someone said that in an actual conversation, you'd be like, okay, your grammar could use a bit of work, but I vaguely get what you mean. If someone came up to you on the street and was like, I struck the board and cried no more, I will abroad, you would probably think that they're speaking in a completely wild way. So Vespers immediately seems a bit more digestible, which will help us parse the meaning. So let's see what the poem sort of means. So even as you appeared, so we're told that even as means just like how you, so we can sort of start by just putting this in. Let's put that in red just to make life a little bit easier for ourselves. So even as you, let's actually put it here, I suppose. Just like how you appear, and I guess actually we'll put it here before appear just to make life a little easier. Just like how you appeared to Moses, and we're told that Moses is from the biblical story of Exodus, when God revealed himself to Moses, a prophet in a burning bush. So Moses is this kind of biblical character. And that's what's important is who is the you here? Well, just like how you appeared to Moses, well, who appeared to Moses? God appeared to Moses. So immediately we know that you is God. So this poem is addressing God. Do we know who's being addressed here? Well, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because I keeps being referenced, thy keeps being mentioned, but there's no direct mention to God, mention of God except for the very end. Here in Vespers, we start off immediately with no doubt about what this poem is about. This is a poem about religion and a poem about God. Just like how you appeared to Moses, because I need you, you appear to me, not often, however. Okay, so if you sort of try to think about what this sort of loosely means, it sort of seems to say, just like how you appeared to Moses, so in other words, just as you, God, appeared to Moses, you appear to me. So in other words, God appears to the speaker in this poem, but God doesn't appear often, right? God appears because I need you, I being the speaker, you being God. So immediately what we're sort of told is God will appear for people, but he appears rarely, and he only appears when people need him. And we're going to, as the poem goes on, get a deeper sense of what it means to need God. So let's keep going. So far we know the speaker is addressing God, and the speaker is basically saying, hey, God, like you're kind of ghosting me, / you are very rarely showing up, right? You appear to me not often. In other words, you appear very infrequently. Okay. I live essentially in darkness. Okay, so one way to interpret this is literally I live in darkness. Maybe, and it's possible you could just make an argument in this debate about why this literally means I live in darkness, like I physically do not have light. But probably the more metaphorically interesting way to interpret this is to think I live essentially in darkness is connecting with the previous statement, which is you, God, appear rarely. And so perhaps we can sort of think of this as basically saying I live essentially without God in my life. God appears rarely and infrequently. And in fact, that's sort of what is implied by the next sentence as well. You are perhaps training me to be responsive to the slightest brightening. So brightening here is not glossed, but we can sort of think of brightening as connecting to this concept of darkness before. So what does brightening mean? It means that light comes into the picture. And darkness seems to be connected to this idea of God not showing up. So brightening seems to be connected to the idea of God showing up. So a pretty fair way to interpret this line, you are perhaps training me to be responsive to the slightest brightening, is to say, God, you rarely show up, and you only show up when I really, really need you. I'm basically living in the dark without you, and maybe that's because you're training me to be looking for the smallest signs of light, the smallest signs that you're there, where light here is a metaphor for God's presence and darkness is a metaphor for God's absence. And what the speaker seems to be saying is, are you trying to get me to be really good at looking for the smallest details that you're present? Are you trying to make me work to find your presence? But the speaker isn't sure about that because the speaker says, or like the poets, are you stimulated, which here means excited into activity. So we can put that in. Do, 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 do. Uh, or like the poets, are you excited into activity by despair? Does grief move you to reveal your nature? So this is interesting. So remember, the speaker is basically asking this question: where is God? Why are you not showing up? Why is he not in my life? And why is he so infrequently appearing? One answer might be maybe God is training me. God is trying to make me this such a loyal believer that I will look for the smallest of smallest clues, the slightest of brightenings in this darkness of my life to see God. Or maybe God is only excited into activity, moved to, quote, reveal his nature by despair and grief. So think about what this means. Maybe what the speaker here mentions poets. Why might poets be mentioned? Well, you can sort of think about this. Like the poets, are you excited into activity by despair and grief? This seems to be a sort of reference to the sort of trope of poets as being motivated by hardship, trauma, pain. And maybe the speaker is sort of saying, poets are moved into action to write their novels and paint their paintings when they are crushed by devastation and grief and hardship and pain. Maybe you're like that. Maybe God is like that. Maybe God only comes into my life when I am in despair, struggling, sad, depressed, grieving, in trauma. So this is a much, much, much more cynical twist on God, right? This twist on God is maybe a bit evil because God is training me to look for even the smallest signs in a life of darkness. This sentence is basically maybe God is so evil or so depraved, he only enters my life when when the world is despairing, when it's grieving, just like a poet only enters the scene to start producing art when they're in a moment of difficulty or hardship. The poem continues. This afternoon, in the physical world to which you commonly contribute your silence, I climbed to the small hill above the wild blueberries, metaphysically descending as on all my walks. Okay, so this is a little bit weird, but this might actually be one of the relatively simpler sentences to parse. So this afternoon, okay, it doesn't seem like there's anything fancy going on here. That literally just means like this afternoon. Like today I was doing something. In the physical world, okay, so this means this maybe is going to set up some contrast later between the physical world and the metaphysical world, like heaven and hell. In the physical world to which you, again, this is addressing God, to which you commonly contribute your silence. Okay, so this seems to again be hearkening back to this idea of darkness, of God rarely showing up. You appear to me not often. So this afternoon, in the physical world to which you commonly contribute your silence basically means this afternoon I was in the physical world, and that's the world, in case you forgot, God, that you basically never show up in. I climbed to the small hill above the wild blueberries. Okay, so this is pretty nice imagery. It doesn't seem to have a tremendous amount of direct meaning, but it seems like a pretty nice aesthetic scene. You know, you're climbing a hill this afternoon. We kind of have a sense of time. We have a sense of what the scenery is. Wild blueberries sounds pretty nice. Metaphysically descending. as on all my walks. So metaphysically descending is the weird one. Fortunately, it's glossed for us. So metaphysically descending means descending into thoughts about the metaphysical, like thoughts about spirituality or existence, or probably, we can probably infer religion, right? Spirituality and religion sort of have similar meanings here. So we can sort of maybe add this in just to make our life a little bit easier. As on all my walks. So think about what this means. I was walking today up this hill with the blueberries. But as I was walking up, I was mentally descending. In other words, I was kind of thinking about metaphysical stuff. And as I kept on thinking, I kept on getting deeper and deeper, lower and lower, if you will, into this metaphysical stuff about spirituality and religion. And this is what I always do when I walk. Then the speaker asks a question. So the speaker, just for context, is walking around with these blueberries, thinking about spirituality. And the speaker asks, did I go deep enough for you to pity me, as you have sometimes pitied others who suffer, favoring those with theological gifts? So did I go deep enough for you to pity me? Okay, what does that mean? Well, it basically seems to be alluding back to this first opening few lines. The speaker wants God to reveal himself, or the speaker is curious why God isn't revealing himself. And so the speaker asks, in this metaphysical descent, as I kept thinking about spirituality, as I kept running my mind over questions about existence and goodness and morality, did I do enough of that for you to pity me? And in here, pity sort of means feel sorrow for someone. And in this context, what that might mean, as happens in sort of the next sentence, maybe it means God shows gifts to people who he pities, who he feels bad for, or feels some sense of sorrow for. And so what this sort of seems to be saying is, as I was walking around with these blueberries, thinking about existence, did I do enough for you to take pity on me, for you to intervene, to show me gifts? What does it mean, you have sometimes pitied others who suffer? Well, it seems to basically be saying, look, I'm suffering for you. Did I do enough? Because it seems like the people that you show gifts to, that you help, are people who've suffered terribly, or the only people you're willing to help are those who have gone through tremendous grief or pain or hardship. That's why God takes pity on them. So this basically is the speaker asking, did I do enough to hearken your presence? As you anticipated, again, you means God, I did not look up. Now, this is interesting, because I did not look up might literally mean something physical, like I did not look up at the sky. But think about what this might mean more metaphorically. I didn't look up. Well, what's up? Well, the sky's up, and what in a religious context, this is a religious poem after all, is up, but heaven, God, spirituality. So the speaker seems to be saying, as God anticipated, I didn't look up. I didn't even look up to the heavens. Maybe this is, and this is my way of interpreting it, although for what it's worth, you might interpret this different ways. This is the way I personally like to interpret this line in the poem. Maybe this is the speaker basically saying, maybe I've kind of given up hope. As God anticipated, I didn't look up. I didn't even bother looking up. I didn't pray to you. I didn't think you would answer me or listen to me or hear me or take pity on me. That's why the speaker's asking this, right? Did I go deep enough? Did I do enough for you, God, to come down and help me? And the speaker says, look, you're right. I am not going to look up to heaven. Maybe this is an expression of doubt, of skepticism, of agnosticism. Maybe the speaker isn't sure. Is God really up there? Is God going to take pity on me and shower me with theological gifts? Theological here just sort of meaning religious or relating to God, of theism. So you, God, came down to me. At my feet, not the wax leaves of the wild blueberry, but your fiery self, a whole pasture of fire and beyond. This red sun, neither falling nor rising. I was not a child. I could take advantage of illusions. Okay, so we'll come back to this final stuff a little bit later, but let's start with this. So you came down to me. So this is where the speaker's expectations are defied. The speaker didn't maybe expect God to come down, or at bare minimum, the speaker's unsure about it. That's why the speaker's asking this. Then God descends down. God comes down, and he comes down to the speaker's feet. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because think about this in contrast to the caller. The caller ends with a hierarchical relationship between God and the narrator of the poem, where God is the Lord, and the Lord considers the narrator of the poem to be his child. And the narrator accepts that hierarchy. He says, my Lord. Here, Vespers is ending with God coming down, God interacting with the narrator of this poem, but God is at the feet of the narrator, not this hierarchical power above or more awesome than the narrator. So immediately we have a different conception or characterization of the relationship between God and his subjects. Here, the relationship is one in which God seems to be more obedient to the narrator, or at bare minimum, God is serving the narrator. He's at the feet of the narrator. Not the wax leaves of the wild blueberry, but the fiery self. Now, what does this mean? Well, not the wax leaves of the wild blueberry, but your fiery self. Maybe what this sort of seems to be a reference to, this is at least the way I interpret it. Remember earlier in the poem when the speaker asks this kind of thought as a statement, maybe you're just training me to be looking for the smallest signs of your presence. Again, darkness meaning God isn't there, brightness meaning God is there. Perhaps what this means is you didn't just show up in this small brightening like the wax leaves of the wild blueberry. Sounds very nice. It sounds very, very elegant, very pleasant. Maybe the sort of thing that God might appear as. No, you, God, came down literally in your whole fiery self. And then we get a description of what God looks like. A fiery self, a whole pasture of fire. That's what God is. God is coming down in godly form at the feet of the narrator. Not hiding, not backing away, not letting the narrator be in darkness. The speaker is coming with a relationship with God where God is at the feet of the narrator of the poem. What about this next line? And beyond the red sun, neither falling nor rising. This is a little bit weird, but don't overthink this one. The red sun, okay, probably just means sun, neither falling nor rising. Why is that weird? Well, it's weird because the sun is in motion, right? The sun is moving up and down, falling and rising throughout the day. So if the sun isn't falling or rising, what does that mean? It means that time has stopped. Or that's, I think, the probably easiest way to interpret this. You might interpret this in other ways. That's totally fair. But it seems like this here sort of seems to be loosely suggesting that time has paused. And God has descended into the physical world. Remember, we have that reference to the physical world earlier, this afternoon in the physical world. So God is in the physical world, but the physical world's laws have stopped. They have fallen to the superior power of God, who, as evidenced in this poem, can do things like freeze time, or at least that's what it seems like is the case based on the sun not falling or rising anymore. So this seems to suggest a very interesting characterization of God. God is this, extraordinarily powerful, fiery being, and a being that's capable of immense power of stopping time as we know it. Yet the God that is described in this poem comes to the very feet of the narrator. We're lastly told, I was not a child. I could take advantage of illusions. This is interesting because it's a kind of a intentionally, or at least in my view, intentionally ambiguous line because it could be read in a couple of ways. So one way is we could think about I was not a child as meaning I now know what the truth is. I now understand what God really is. And maybe this I could take advantage of illusions claim. Well, maybe, think about what happens in the last two lines, right? Like God descends as this fiery self consuming the entire pasture in fire and the sun is frozen in the sky. This seems like an illusion. This seems wildly implausible based on everything we know about the world and everything the speaker knows about the world. Maybe this line sort of roughly means I now know. I understand. I get what it means for God to exist because I can take advantage of these illusions. I understand this mystical, metaphysically defying, baffling concept that is God. And maybe that's what it means that I was not a child. What is not a child? It's an adult. It's someone who's grown up. If you're not a child, that means you've matured. So maybe by the speaker saying I was not a child, what the speaker is basically saying is I have matured. I understand. I've learned. And that's why I can, quote unquote, take advantage of illusions. Illusions perhaps being this impossibility of God the speaker can now reconcile and sort of understand. So just to kind of sum it all up, the speaker starts with this kind of deep existential angst. Why does God not appear? Maybe it's because God is training me to look for his presence in everything. Maybe it's because God is evil and wicked, and he only is excited into action when I'm in a difficult moment. Then the speaker describes what they do. They go throughout the world. They're climbing up these blueberry hills. And as they're deep in thought, God appears to them. And God appears to them not as a master, but perhaps more as a servant at the feet of the narrator. And this impossible illusion of God is understood to be true by the speaker. And the speaker matures by the end of the poem and accepts, perhaps, or understands God at the bare minimum. Okay, so that's roughly what both poems mean. So that doesn't help you per se make arguments, but honestly, if you can go through that process in prep or as you're thinking about the motion and really think through what these poems mean, odds are that alone gives you a bunch of material to work with in the debate. Why? Well, because there's basically two debates in this debate. Debate one, what do you as a Christians struggling with religious disillusionment want from art? Clash 2, which of the two poems best satisfies that? So this is where we can talk a little bit more about arguments. I'll be a little bit briefer here because I've alluded to most of the thoughts I would have on these arguments. And so I'll make this a little bit briefer. And part of the reason is because this is kind of where you get to make some of your own artistic judgments about what you think is more compelling to us, to the actor in the motion, and what sorts of art might be more comforting or meaningful or cathartic to someone who's struggling with religious disillusionment and in a kind of crisis of identity. So I think you can break this debate basically into two types of arguments. There are substantive arguments, which I would loosely call arguments about the substance of the poems, the literal meaning of the poems, like the substance, the message, the ideas. And then there are aesthetic arguments about the beauty of the poem, the literary devices in the poems, the sorts of things that both poets do to make the poems read more powerfully and read more elegantly. So let's talk about substantive arguments. There's an interesting clash here which says, is God good or evil? Because both poems go back and forth on this question. There's one way to read the Caller, which says that God at his core is an evil God. He is a God who, if you think about it, lets his people languish. He lets them sigh and pine. He lets their lives shrivel up. He lets them dry their wine in sighs and drown their bread in tears. And you could very plausibly read the Caller and say, this is an evil God, and then make a very compelling argument that says, for example, on Gov, as a person struggling with religious disillusionment, what you want is comfort in this moment. Why are you disillusioned? Perhaps you're disillusioned most plausibly because you struggle to understand how the world around you could be consistent with the God you have been told by Christianity is real, an all-loving and all-powerful and all-knowing God. And maybe, just maybe, what you want in art is a sense of catharsis and recognition. You want to read a poem that speaks to your struggle to understand how it is that God could allow this world to be as barren and painful and traumatic as it is. And perhaps the Caller does that best, because the Caller speaks directly to this concept of material deprivation and emotional poverty and God's either inability or unwillingness to intervene or to help us. And that's why we have all of these references to harvests with a thorn and blood and sighs and tears and drowning. But of course, you could also read the Vespers to have a similar message and maybe a more powerful message. You could, for example, read Vespers as noting that why, according to the speaker, does God come to people? It's for reasons that seem fundamentally perverted, even wicked. God appears, God intervenes, because God is moved to action by despair and grief. Why does God even visit the speaker while the speaker is off traipsing around the blueberry fields? Well, it seems it's because, bluntly, the speaker is in this deeply metaphysically anxious state of wandering around with these deep burning questions of whether God is real or what God wants or why God is valuable or meaningful, why he's never there. So Vespers seems to suggest a very cruel characterization of God, a characterization of God which says that God is not willing to love you unconditionally. God shows himself to you only when he wants to be shown, and he only wants to be shown in the very darkest of moments, when you most desperately need God, when you are in despair, when you're in grief. And of course, you could also make arguments either on the other side that say, look, maybe, for example, if you're Gov and want to say Vespers is more optimistic about God or vice versa for the Caller, you could also point out that both poems are a bit agnostic on the question of whether God is good. For example, think about the way that the Caller ends. The Caller ends with the revolution ending. The rebellion is over. The speaker pledges fealty to God. The speaker cries out, "My Lord," after hearing the Lord speak to him. Maybe you could arguably say, if you're, for example, on the Vesper side, the Caller is maybe too optimistic. It's almost too upbeat. The speaker in the end, think about how the speaker characterizes everything they've said. As I raved, as I spoke with extreme emotion and grew more fierce and wild, that's when they suddenly realized they were wrong. Maybe this last stanza is the speaker basically saying, I was wrong about this. I take it back. I do agree that the Lord is there, and I pledge allegiance or loyalty to God. On the flip side, maybe you, for example, are on the Caller side and you want to make the claim that Vespers is a relatively, at least mixed poem in its characterization of God. Well, think about the ending of Vespers and how Vespers characterizes God. God reveals himself in the end to the narrator. And more than that, the characterization of God in this final few lines, 14 to 19, is pretty magnificent. This fiery self consuming a pasture of fire, a being capable of suspending time, a being who makes the speaker not a child, who educates the speaker, brings knowledge to the speaker. The speaker's fear and anxiety in the first 13 to 14 lines of the poem is deeply about anxiety of not knowing if God is there for him. And that anxiety is quenched in the end. So you could plausibly make arguments either way to say, if what you are looking for in a poem is recognition of God's profound evilness, maybe you get it better in one poem or the other. By the way, you could also invert all of this and make the exact opposite argument and say, as a person struggling with religious discontent, maybe what brings you the most meaning is optimism. Maybe you want art that gives you a sense of hope. You are struggling, but things will get better because God is there. God does care for you, or God will intervene. Remember, the common thread throughout both of these poems is a question of where is God? In Vespers, that question is explicit. The question explicitly is asked, why is God not showing up? In the Caller, the question is still there implicitly, right? All of this first opening 12-ish lines, all of this is basically implying a question. Why is my life so shit? Why am I losing health, wanting to go away? Why am I struggling so much? I struck the board and cried no more. The question that's being begged in the Caller is, where the fuck is God? And you could very plausibly make an argument here that sort of answers this in a similar way that, you know, it comes up in Vespers, and make arguments about why perhaps more optimistic understanding that God will arrive is really what you need. Remember, both poets in these poems are struggling with religious discontent. They're going through what the actor is going through. And look at what both poets end up arriving at as their conclusion. They both arrive at the end. They both start in a depressive state, right? Both poems start with deep nihilism, and they both end, at least somewhat, with recognition of God. Now, there's a subclash, by the way, that you might discuss, which is maybe we should believe in God, maybe we shouldn't. And there's probably a subclash that you can use some of the stanza lines that we talked about before there. But there's then another clash here, which is, if we believe in God, why should we believe in God? If you look at the Caller, look at why the speaker ends up believing in God. I thought I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my Lord. This is not a definitive statement of firm belief. Me thought? I thought? This is a qualifying statement that calls everything that follows into question. I thought I heard one calling, and I replied, did you hear or did you not hear? Well, the speaker says, I thought I heard. What that seems to suggest is maybe God is an illusion. Maybe the speaker hallucinated this. Maybe they made it up. Maybe it's not real. Maybe it is just all in their head. Maybe they raved so much, they grew so fierce and wild that they convinced themselves they were mad. I'm just speculating here. But you could plausibly make an argument that says, if you as a speaker are looking for religious certainty, you don't really get it in the Caller. The Caller ends with profound uncertainty. Is God there? Or is this speaker driven to madness by their anxiety and confusion about God? You could, of course, ask a similar question about Vespers, though, and about whether Vespers' understanding of religious belief is any better. Vesper ends with a pretty remarkable understanding of God. The speaker ends by fully accepting, I was not a child, this new reality of God. All of these questions that are asked in the very beginning, or like the poets, are you stimulated by despair? These questions seemingly are at least partially answered by the end of the poem with a relative degree of certainty. God appears to the speaker, not as I thought I heard a voice that might have been God, but literally in the form of a fiery pasture. And by the way, the fiery pasture could very plausibly be a reference to Moses, right? Remember Moses, God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush. And what do we have in the end of the poem? A pasture of fire. It's plausible there's a connection there. So maybe you say, for example, on op, there's a plausible op argument that says what you might want is a sense of certainty. And you get that certainty from Vespers. You get a sense of what it means to believe in God. And what does it mean to believe in God? It means to accept the contradictions of God. It means to accept that God might be an illusion, that God can pause time, that God can burn an entire field up while being at your feet. But to accept God just means to accept these contradictions. Maybe the resolution at the end of the Caller is more uncertain. It's more plagued by a question of whether this is real or not. So there's a clash on Is it good to definitively double down on the belief in God? There are arguments both ways that you can make for why you as a despairing person might or might not want that, or it might or might not serve you. And then subsequently, you can make additional arguments about, for example, which poem better serves that. The next thing that you can also ask in terms of substantive arguments is, when God fails us, how does he fail us? So think, for example, about the characterization of God's oppression in Vespers. What does Vespers say about God's evilness? The evilness is absence. The evilness is, where the fuck are you, God? Why aren't you here? The whole point of these first sort of 7-ish lines in Vespers is asking this question of, why aren't you here? I am living in darkness. You are training me to look for you in the smallest of places because you aren't anywhere to be found. You only appear when people are profoundly sad. Vespers suggests the anxiety around religion comes from God not being present. But look at, in contrast, the caller. The caller seems to have a very different understanding of God, because everything that the narrator in this poem seems to discuss essentially seems more so to be about all of the active harms that are going on in the world, all of the direct ways in which their life is terrible, right? Think about what the speaker is basically describing in this case. The speaker is describing a world of crying, blood, scarcity, poverty. Now, maybe you could interpret that as God is absent. Why isn't God filling up my bottles of wine and giving me corn? But there's also another, and I think an equally fair way to interpret it, which is that God has constructed this world in which I am caged. I am trapped. Think about this line, cage. A cage is an active imposition on one's freedom. The narrative in the caller is that the reason God oppresses, or the way God oppresses rather, is through active imposition of maybe evilness or cruelty. And that's why the speaker says, I need to leave this cold dispute and reject my cage. That seems to suggest that the profound oppressiveness of religion originates not in God's non-intervention, but in his intervention. And so you can make arguments on both sides. Which of these is more palatable to you? Which of these is more believable to you? As a person struggling with religious disillusionment, are you disillusioned because God is not there for you when you need him most? Or is it because you blame God for the world around you, because he has constructed this world and he has imposed his will upon you? The other thing that you might think about substantively is, what is the purpose of rebellion? Because both speakers, both poems flirt with the idea of rejecting God. It's very explicit in the caller. So in the caller, we have this explicit section about recovering these years of sorrow by doubling up on pleasure and rejecting God wholesale. But we also get it implicitly in Vespers. There's this line, for example, in Vespers that says, as you anticipated, I didn't look up. And by the way, all the other stuff thus far, sort of in the beginning of Vespers, are questions directly about, like, where are you, God? I don't see you. I struggle to see you. Why aren't you appearing to me? So both poems grapple with that question of rebellion. And you can make arguments on either side about, A, is flirtation with sin or flirtation with rebellion comforting to you? Or is it jarring? Maybe you don't want to be comforted by the appeal of rebellion. Maybe it's hard for you to leave your religion. You need to be in your religion. Everyone else is in your religion. It's very plausible, for instance, that you want comfort by finding a way to reconcile your religious identity, not get rid of it. And so maybe you might make arguments about which poem better deals with that process of coming to terms with your religion, even in spite of the questions that you have. So, for example, you might say plausibly, the caller offers a pretty profound resolution to this uncertainty. The caller accepts, the speaker on the caller, that is, just accepts at the end that they have heard God, even though it's a bit cloudy whether or not they have. And maybe for the speaker, that seems to be enough. That might be comforting, perhaps, as a person struggling with religious disillusionment. And maybe by contrast, Vespers is profoundly nihilistic. No, the vast majority of people are not going to have God descend to their feet in a blueberry field and pause time itself. So if you rely on Vespers for that sense of comfort, it might be profoundly distressing. The reason Vespers ends up with this sense of comfort at the end, of maturity from not being a child, is from something that seems wildly unrelatable to someone who's actually struggling with religious disillusionment. On the other hand, you might flip it and say, maybe to some extent, Vespers is a more comforting image because of the characterization offers of what God does for us. Remember, what is the resolution in the caller? The resolution in the first poem, the caller, is God is my master. The resolution in Vespers is God came down at my feet He didn't show up as a blueberry. He showed up as God fucking himself. So it's plausible that Vespers, even though the specific scene here is unlikely, and in fact almost completely unlikely to ever happen to any individual, it is more comforting because what you are told is that even when perhaps God is not visible, the God that exists is a God that does to some extent serve us, even if you can't see him in the blueberries and the slightest brightenings in the darkness. So there are lots more ways that you can substantively argue this. Those are just a series of thoughts on how to approach making substantive arguments. There's a lot of vertical depth on all of these clashes, because if you're a closing half team, almost certainly there's a dual debate on top half. Debate one, what do you as the actor want? Debate two, which poem better serves it? And that second clash is where there's a lot of ripe material, because both poems are sufficiently interpretable and subjective that you can make arguments either way. Last thing I'll talk about are aesthetics arguments. By aesthetics, what I basically just mean is the beauty of the poem itself. There's one clash on the titles. So, for example, there might be an interesting argument that says, Vespers, is this a meaningful or not meaningful title? I mean, Vespers is pretty rawly descriptive, right? It's literally just describing a service of evening prayer. If you're struggling with religious disillusionment, is that meaningful to you? Does the remembrance of Christian service bring you a sense of comfort or optimism that things might be better, that perhaps one day you can enjoy those evening prayers? Or is it just despondent, perhaps, to be reminded of that trauma? On the flip side, the collar is a very deliberate phrase to use as a title. What is a collar? Well, in the kind of classical fashion sense, it's constrictive, right? It goes around your neck. Maybe this is kind of a reference even later to rejecting your cage and your rope of sands. Perhaps this is a reference to that constrictive nature of religion. Again, there's a whole clash here. Is characterizing religion as fundamentally restrictive comforting or agitating for you? Will it agitate your anxiety to consume a poem that feeds into your darkest worries, or will it soothe you and remind you that you aren't alone? There are arguments both sides. The other aesthetics arguments you might make are about the poems themselves. So, for example, there's one argument that is just a pretty straightforward argument about the readability of the poems. Vespers, as I mentioned before, is a much more readable poem. Maybe that's good. Maybe Opp says it is more important to find a poem that you can read easily and digest easily the first time around than a poem that requires lots of complicated parsing through. It's much easier to understand Vespers than it is to understand the collar, and maybe that's important. Maybe simplicity allows you to engage more with the poem, to read it more times, to embrace it at a deeper level. Maybe you'll be irritated and angered by the complexity of Vespers. But there's a different way to think about it, which is Vespers in some ways is much more metaphorical. The reason Vespers is harder to read is because it isn't written as straightforwardly. It's trying to obscure its meaning. And that might itself be valuable. Why? Because remember the actor in the motion. The actor in the motion is someone who is struggling with their religious identity. It's not easy to struggle with your religious identity. Maybe you don't want to be spoon-fed a relatively easy to read poem. Maybe the struggle is what brings you value in the poem, because the first read-through gives you a different interpretation than the fifth read-through, than the 10th read-through, and so on and so forth. There's also an argument about descriptive beauty. Think about the words that are used in these two poems. Vespers is aesthetically beautiful. Just look at the words that are used, right? The wild blueberries, the small hill, the wild blueberries referenced again, the wax leaves, the fiery self, a whole pasture of fire, the red sun. It's very descriptive. It's very elegant. You get this beautiful image in your mind of the speaker climbing up this hill, looking over this field of blueberries as God comes down to, and speaks with them. By contrast, what do we get from the collar? The collar is almost halting, right? Think about the words that we keep having show up. Struck, bored, pride, harvest, thorn, blood, not restore, lost, sighs, tears, drown, only. We get this temporary reprieve of talking about pleasures. But even when we're thinking about religion, how does this section characterize religion? Cold disputes, cages, ropes of sand. The tone of the collar is much more grindingly negative. And so you might make arguments on either side. There's a Gov argument that says this is relatable. This is what you're feeling right now. That's what you want in a poem. There's an Opp argument that says it's the inverse. This will agitate you. It will irritate you. It will feed into your worst desires. It will only make your rage and anger and frustration much worse, and will only worsen that difficulty and that hardship. Lastly, you might make arguments about the poem's aesthetics. So, and whether that's relatable to you. Both poems use lots of metaphors, including to the Bible. There's an explicit reference to Moses, for example, in Vespers. There are references to wine, which shows up very frequently in the Bible in the collar. And you can make arguments about relatability, right? Which of these metaphors, which of these references sticks the most with you? Do you want to be reminded, for example, of things that seem very tangible, like the story you read in Bible school as a child of God descending to Moses? Or do you want to maybe have slightly more abstract metaphors, the farm metaphors, for example, that show up in the collar? Again, reasonable arguments you might make either way about A, which is more relatable, and then B, you would impact why relatability matters. For example, one reason relatability probably matters is because as a person in this position, you probably feel alone. You probably feel like you can't talk about this with many other people because it's probably stigmatized in especially Christian communities to talk openly about your deepest, darkest insecurities about your religious faith and your religious identity. And maybe having that sense of relatability of this poem gets me, it speaks to my insecurities, might be very moving. Anyways, hope this helps. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.